This is Jennifer Vreeland with the Gulf of Mexico Coastal Ocean Observing System. Welcome everybody to the webinar today. We are super excited. I just wanted to explain a little bit how we're set up today. Our webinar series is presented by GCAN and NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program in partnership. And we like to try to hold these events once a month. I would also like to introduce you. I'm handing the baton over to NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program's Knaus Fellow, Mike Acquafreda, and he's going to be introducing you to our speaker today. And before I do that, I just would like to give a little instruction. We're going to hold off on questions throughout the presentation until the presentation is completed, and you can write your questions in the chat box. And I will be helping Mike at the end of the presentation today to facilitate those questions. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Mike.
Hi, everyone. This is Mike Acquafreda. I'm really happy to introduce our speaker today, Haille Leija. Haille is the Habitat Restoration Manager for the Galveston Bay Foundation. She oversees the Oyster Shell Recycling Program and manages the Foundation's oyster reef restoration efforts, as well as its living shoreline projects. The title of her talk is Habitat Restoration and Shoreline Protection in Galveston Bay. And Haille, you could now take it away.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, Mike, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to speak with all of you. So like Mike said, I oversee some of our habitat restoration at Galveston Bay Foundation. And just to give you guys a quick introduction to the foundation in case you're not familiar with our work, we are a local nonprofit based out of the Houston-Galveston region. We actually just moved to our official headquarters on the bay in Kemah, Texas. So that's located southeast of downtown Houston. And as a foundation, our mission is to both preserve and enhance Galveston Bay's resources, both for the environmental benefits, as well as for the benefits of the local communities surrounding that entire system. And I always like to start off with a map of the area because a lot of folks find our name to be a bit of a misnomer. We are actually not focused solely on Galveston Island, but in fact, the entire Galveston, including its 3 sub-bays, Trinity, East, and West Bay. So that also includes our work in the 4 surrounding counties. So we're both working on land and in the water to protect those habitats. Now we do this through a variety of program areas, specifically our education team. They work in schools, actually getting kids K through 12 out into the field, exposed to the bay and the elements. They often plant marsh grass with us, build oyster reefs, and learn all about the ecosystem. And I'll be talking today more about our restoration efforts, but we also have a water quality and quantity group that works with volunteers to monitor water quality all around Galveston Bay. And actually some of that volunteer data is incorporated in our state's programs. And I believe some of our water team has worked with GCAN in the past. So I'll be curious to see if anyone on this call is familiar with that. And we do have a land conservation team who focuses on actually acquiring properties, both fee simple properties and conservation easements to preserve that land within the watershed of Galveston Bay. And they actually do quite a bit of coastal prairie restoration as well as freshwater wetland restoration. And last but not least, we have an advocacy team who works at both state and federal levels to address important policy issues. So just to kick things off, I want to let you know a little bit about the Galveston Bay system and why we do what we do. So while we still are very much thriving and have an abundant estuary, we have lost over 8,000 acres of intertidal marsh habitat, and we've seen over 60% of our oyster reefs completely decimated. And so this habitat degradation has been identified as one of the key issues in Galveston Bay by all of the key stakeholders in the area. So in order to address that issue, the foundation works together with all sorts of partners to address specific habitats. And today I'm going to give you a little bit of background on our wetland restoration efforts, our shoreline protection projects, as well as our oyster reef restoration. So first of all, we have mainly been focused on marsh restoration since we started in 1987. This has been a critical issue in Galveston Bay due to the significant subsidence as a result of groundwater withdrawal. So a lot of that subsidence caused our marshes to essentially drown. So we've been working with partners for many years to restore that intertidal marsh habitat. And we're actually very fortunate that we have an amazing partnership with NRG Energy and NRCS. And we have been able to maintain a nursery for Spartina alterniflora, and that way we have that grass available to us as well as our partners for these projects. So since the initiation of the foundation, we've restored over 600 acres of intertidal marsh, and I'm going to go through a few of our project examples just to give you an idea of some of the methodologies we use to restore that habitat. So this first screen here shows you an example of our Burnett Bay marsh restoration project. So this is a great example of the marsh mounding technique. And essentially what that is, we pump material from an associated borrow site into these small mounded areas. And basically what that does is just raise the elevation to the ideal height for that Spartina alterniflora to grow. And so then we come back either with contractors or volunteers to plant that marsh grass. And so you can see there in those bottom two images, that initial planting in 2009, it really took off right away. And also you can see in the 2020 Google Earth imagery just how much of those mounds are now fully covered with marsh. So this is a similar project, a little bit different technique and approach. This is in our Pierce Marsh property, and this is a great partnership with NOAA and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, amongst many other state and federal partners. But this is a great example of beneficial use. So this project uses levee systems. So you can see there the different cells that are divided by these raised levees. And then we work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers during their dredge cycles. The intercoastal waterway is directly adjacent to this project. So we're able to have them align their dredge pumps and pipes to directly fill these cells with that dredge material. And over time, as it begins to dewater, then we can come back in and plant either stems or even just seeds of that Spartina. And over time, you'll see it begin to flourish, like you can see there in the bottom images. Now, this project has been going on since, oh goodness, 2015, I want to say, to complete. But this particular area is in its final stages, and we are now actually starting to bring down some of those levees so it can get more exposed to tidal flow and that sort of thing, because the marsh is just growing so abundantly. We need some open water habitat in there as well. So last but not least, I wanted to point out that we do our shoreline protection, of course, to protect the shoreline from erosion, but also to restore marsh habitat. And so we've been able to restore over 50 acres of marsh just by protecting the shoreline with some sort of a wave barrier. So you can see here on these images, the one on the left is from 2010. And the first two most northern sites, you can see where the breakwaters were initially installed, and that southern site still doesn't have a breakwater in that image. And then if you look to the right-hand side, that 2020 imagery, you can see where that marsh has really begun to fill in. And I wanted to call your attention to the southernmost site. That's actually one of the foundation's preserves. It's our Shipe Woods property. And so this is a great example of how successful the wave break can be. And we installed this with contractors at Rock Breakwater offshore, but then came back and planted with volunteers. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner there, that is what that property first looked like when we obtained it. Severe erosion, trees literally falling into the water. But if you look on the left now, we're seeing actual sediment building up, that erosion halting, and the marsh flourishing. So that brings me to my next topic, shoreline protection. As I mentioned, we use this not only to create marsh habitat, but also to protect the shoreline from erosion, particularly at sites like you see in this image. This is in far west Galveston Bay. And on the left-hand side, there's Oyster Lake. And this site actually backs up to the Intracoastal Waterway. And there was fear that this small barrier here would breach and cause a lot of issues for the Intracoastal Waterway, requiring it to be dredged more often. So this project has been staged out, starting with small reef mounds and then eventually getting to this larger scale rock breakwater that you can see here. And this is probably one of our largest projects. It's about 2 miles long at this time and still has a ways to go. But I just want to point this out because this is one of our outstanding projects that my supervisor, Philip Smith, has done. And so to date, we have been able to protect over 20 miles of shoreline with a variety of different shoreline protection techniques. So this is that same project in Oyster Lake, and this is a very typical approach that we use, basically installing these rock breakwaters with either limestone or concrete riprap. It's all clean rock, nothing recycled from construction sites. We want to ensure there's nothing harmful going into the waters. And this is all done by contractors. So you can see in the back there that spud barge, and they mechanically place that rock. So the great thing about these projects is it is creating a living shoreline because we're not installing a hard structure right on shore. We're installing that rock breakwater further offshore. And that allows for the water to pass through it when the waves approach and sediment to drop out of suspension behind it. So I love this picture because you really see that sediment beginning to deposit there. And so over time, as that sediment accumulates, and we're actually building up land that's been lost, and we come in and plant that Spartina alterniflora to further secure that sediment in place and, of course, create that important nursery habitat. Now, this is another example of a living shoreline, but on a much smaller scale. You can see in that top left-hand corner, there's a low-profile rock breakwater. So same idea as that in previous picture, but on a much smaller scale. I believe this was a public park. And I also like to point out this project because it's very unique in the fact that there is an existing bulkhead in place. They had some failure of the bulkhead further around the corner, not that you can see it in this picture. But point is, you can still install a living shoreline where there is already a bulkhead in place. As you can see, we planted with volunteers and had great success with that Spartina taking off. Now, we also use other types of materials to create living shorelines or wave breaks. And this example right here shows the installation of sackcrete bags. And these work great for oyster recruitment, as you can see. And similarly to the rock breakwaters, they also allow for sediment buildup behind there and further protecting that marsh habitat. Another structure we use are reef domes or reef balls you might have heard of, and they can be placed either by contractors or the smaller ones can go in with volunteer efforts. Now, these reef domes and the sackcrete bags work much better in lower energy environments we've found, but both are excellent oyster mulch. And last but not least, we have begun incorporating our recycled oyster shell into breakwaters and living shorelines. So I'll get into this a little bit more later, but just wanted to show you an example of some of those great projects. All right, so finally, we're on to oyster reef restoration, near and dear to my heart. I specifically oversee our shell recycling operations and getting that shell back into the bay to create oyster habitat. So to get us started on this topic, I wanted to give you just a little bit more background of why we got into reef restoration. In 2008, the Galveston area was hit with Hurricane Ike, as I'm sure many of you know. And unfortunately, that hurricane brought in an incredible amount of sediment with the tidal surge. And while oysters can survive some of that, because of the low profile of our reefs in Galveston Bay from the years and years of harvest, most of those reefs were smothered by that sediment. So you can see on this map here in central Galveston Bay, we lost about 60% of that reef habitat and over 90% in East Bay. So it really decimated our oysters. So then fast forward almost 10 years later, and here comes Hurricane Harvey. Well, that essentially turned Galveston Bay into a freshwater lake. And those same areas were really hit hard. Basically, it prevented those oysters from spawning, and it even caused some mortality. But I promise you, it's not all doom and gloom. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background there of some of the challenges we've been facing. So in order to help curb some of these issues, particularly the loss of that hard substrate from Hurricane Ike, the Galveston Bay Foundation initiated an oyster shell recycling program in 2011 to collect shell from restaurants that would otherwise end up in a landfill, and we return that shell to the bay to create that new oyster habitat. So I want to give you a quick overview of how this operation works. We actually have staff that collect the shell from restaurants on a weekly basis. Depending on the restaurant's output of shell, we might visit them 1 to 3 times a week. And each restaurant receives a number of recycling bins or buckets depending on their output. And we really strive to remain grassroots and work one-on-one with those restaurants to ensure that we're accommodating them because they are doing a great service. And fortunately, at this time, we are able to do this completely free for the restaurants, although we may have to move to a fee-based service in the future. But thanks to our continuous grant funding from NOAA through our coastal management program, we've been able to provide all the supplies and services for free. So once we collect full bins of shell from the restaurants, we then take them to one of our upland storage sites that we call our curing sites. And that shell is staged there for a minimum of 6 months to ensure that it's fully sun bleached or sun cured. So we spread it out for a good majority of that time and then use tractors to actually pile that shell and rotate it throughout the 6-month process to fully expose it to the sun. And that basically ensures that any pathogens on that shell or even invasive species are eliminated before we ever even think about returning that shell to the bay. And of course, we don't always know where our restaurants are getting their oysters. Some of them import from other parts of the country. And so we want to ensure that we're returning clean shell back into the water. So once that shell is quarantined and ready to go, we return it to the bay through a variety of efforts. Most of those are volunteer-based. So one of those efforts is our volunteer oyster gardening program. And this program is truly focused on community engagement and education. We work with some amazing volunteers who have homes on the bayfront, and we build oyster gardens with them, either cages, bags, or strings of recycled shell that are then deployed into the water during the spawning season. And we're very fortunate here in Galveston Bay to have a wild larvae population because we're able to place just bare shell and see recruitment on that shell. So of course, what we like to see is that top right-hand corner there, lots and lots of fat attaching. So after the spawning season ends, typically in the fall, we go out and collect all of the gardens from our volunteers and then empty those out onto our reef restoration sites so that they help to bolster those populations or even kickstart a new project. So all of these sites are off limits to harvest and therefore preservation and ecosystem benefits especially. And I did want to mention a side note. So you see that top right-hand corner, that's very similar to what we saw the year of Hurricane Harvey. And unfortunately, many of those oysters died before we were able to get them from our gardeners, but it probably would have been one of our highest recruitment years in a long time. But not all bad news. It is coming back. We're seeing large populations flourish in West Galveston Bay and kind of the southern reaches of the bay system. And we do have some amazing volunteers who continue to work with us. They even like to call themselves the oyster foster parents. So we're very fortunate to have those folks on board. Now, in addition to the oyster gardening, which is really more used towards reef enhancement and volunteer engagement, we also build those oyster shell breakwaters that I showed you earlier with volunteer efforts. So to give you an idea of how this is done, these breakwaters are just essentially mesh aquaculture bags filled with our recycled shell stacked in the pyramid formation that you can see from this side view diagram. And that basically builds up a structure just like you would with the rock breakwater, but at a much lower profile. So again, these are used more in low energy environments like you see here at our Sweetwater Preserve. This is actually in a small lake that's tidally influenced by West Galveston Bay. Now, the way we do this, we have groups of volunteers come out with us, typically for about half a day, and they actually bag that shell, each of which weighs about 30 pounds, so you get a good workout. And then we float that shell out to the construction site using these aquaculture tubs. Thanks to the advice of some of my friends in Florida, these tubs have saved a lot of backbreaking work. And then those bags are placed one by one into that pyramid formation. And we do put down geotextile fabric first to help reduce the subsidence of those bags into the sediment. And of course, this is what we hope to see over time. Lots of new oyster recruitment onto those recycled shells, with the ultimate goal of that shell breakwater becoming encrusted with oysters so that it can provide a harder structure to reduce the wave action and reduce erosion along that shoreline. But of course, it also benefits by creating that oyster habitat for many other species as well. And we come back and plant the marsh grass just like we would with any other living shoreline effort. So in addition to these smaller volunteer-based reef restoration efforts, we are slowly but surely looking into larger scale reef restoration, particularly with our partners like Texas Parks and Wildlife and the Nature Conservancy. And one approach we've taken thus far is reef mounding. So this project right here was done in Dickinson Bay, adjacent to some existing oyster habitat and a bird rookery island. And that's about 200 tons of our recycled shell. Now that took us over 2 years to collect. On average, we're collecting about 100 tons a year. So it was pretty daunting to see all of that go back into the bay in a matter of hours. But we did work with some amazing contractors who are very skilled at placing that shell very strategically, essentially in the same mounded position that you see there on the barge, but at a little bit lower profile, about 1.5 feet off of the bay bottom. And so we're hoping that with this design, it will provide more elevation and relief so that in conditions where the sediment does fill in, those oysters have a better chance of surviving. Although this has not been done to my knowledge with loose shell, so we're really excited to see the results of our monitoring and see kind of how things are shifting around, if we're seeing recruitment out there. Unfortunately, that was set to be done this month with our partners at Texas A&M Galveston and their scientific diving team, but with the pandemic, that has been put on hold. So fingers crossed, we should be monitoring this first large-scale effort in the fall and hope to see some good results there. So to date, we have recycled over 1,000 tons of shell. That's about 2 million pounds that would have otherwise ended up in a landfill. And over half of that has been returned to the bay, mostly by volunteers. But right now, we are still very small in terms of shell recycling. I'm sure you're familiar with other programs like the incredible Billion Oyster Project in New York or Coalition to Restore Coastal Louisiana. And they have outsourced to vendors, but we are still very much grassroots, working with our staff and a truck and a trailer. And so I wanted to show this map because that indicates where our current restaurant partners are located that recycle shell with us. So we are really only going out about a 20-mile radius from our office headquarters. And we would really like to be able to expand into downtown Houston. So we have been in the process of doing some strategic planning for this program, because as we start to find ways to utilize our shell in larger quantities, we also need to be accumulating more shell. You know, that one project I just showed you took out 2 years of shell recycling. So that is quite an effort. We need to, you know, up our game a little bit if we're going to do these larger scale projects. So through some research, you know, we've indicated where the majority of the seafood restaurants are that sell oyster shell, and it's very clear that those are very densely populated in the inner loop of Houston, so kind of where that 20-mile radius ends. So in order to reach those, we need additional equipment, additional funding, and resources. So we're looking forward to next year. We're hoping to actually make this expansion happen into the inner loop of Houston. It was set to kind of kick off this year with an inaugural Houston Oyster Festival that we'll be sponsoring to fundraise. But again, thanks to the pandemic, that has been shifted to next April. But it gives us a little bit more time to plan it and get it just right. So we're not concerned. We've also been fortunate to receive some great funding. So I think we will be able to purchase new equipment that will help increase our capacity in shell collection and reduce the labor. We're looking at purchasing a large diesel truck with a dump insert and a bin lift. So our staff will not have to haul those heavy bins. Each one can weigh 200 pounds apiece. So you can imagine hauling 20 to 30 of those a day gets very exhausting. So with this truck, we'll be able to double our capacity of what we can hold, which will make our shell recycling runs much more efficient. And hopefully we'll be able to target some of those more congested restaurants in downtown Houston and increase the volume of shell that we can bring into the foundation. So one last thing I wanted to mention, as we are looking to expand and improve our process, we decided it was time to bring all the key players together and figure out some of the best methodologies and ways to restore reef in Galveston Bay. So we worked with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department and our local estuary program to reinstate the Galveston Bay Oyster Workgroup last year. And so this group is bringing together all of the partners, agencies, NGOs, you name it, to help identify both funding and partnership opportunities, find ways to work together so that we can properly site future reef restoration projects and determine how we can work together to use our recycled shell and work with the state who are focused on harvesting to come together and provide a more sustainable oyster population for all of the benefits associated, both economical and environmental. And we're also working together to help facilitate research. There seems to be a huge gap of research in Galveston Bay on oyster reef restoration. And so we are starting a lot of university partnerships to help fill some of those gaps. So we're really excited for what the future holds with this program. And last but not least, just wanted to say a quick thank you to all of our partners and sponsors. We are a nonprofit, so we couldn't do it without all of these amazing partners. And that is it. I really appreciate your time. Thank you for listening in, and I am here for questions, so please ask away.
All right, so I'm just checking out the questions box. And it looks like we have a few questions. This first one is, has there been any research into what types of shell provide the best substrate for restoration, i.e. do non-native oyster shells that have been imported from other parts of the country recruit as well as native shells do?
Oh, that's a great question. There is no research to my knowledge. I know there's quite a bit of research on different types of culch, so, you know, limestone versus porcelain versus shell. But just from my anecdotal observations, we have not seen any particular difference in the types of shell. And like I mentioned, we're not always 100% sure where restaurants are obtaining their oysters, so it varies depending on seasonality, you know, how our oyster populations and economy are doing. So it can really vary a lot. So it's very hard to track exactly the source of that individual shell. But yeah, that's a great question and should be researched.
Excellent. Another question we got is, have you found any alternatives to oyster bags that you currently use, which may break down and leave plastic in the environment?
Oh, excellent question. This is a hot topic right now and something that is currently being addressed by many organizations. It's actually come up at the last couple Restore America's Estuary summits and workshops, and we are all frantically working to find an alternative. I will say in Texas, we have tried coconut husk bags, coral logs, that sort of thing, but they break down so fast that then the shell just simply gets dispersed and lost to the sediment, therefore losing that really important, valuable resource. So we are now working with a bunch of university partners to connect some research. And one of our amazing partners at A&M Galveston had the brilliant idea to repurpose old shrimp nets. So they're currently testing that out at some of our project sites. We will also be utilizing gabion cages at a new project to test that out and see how it works. They are a bit more expensive. So that kind of creates an issue with the cost benefit of that project. But yes, we are open to ideas on that, as I know many other organizations are. We've even been in touch with companies like Filtrex International to discuss how to design something that's more natural and would withstand at least 3 to 5 years, maybe even more within this environment. So yeah, great question. We are moving away from the plastic mesh.
Excellent, thank you. Another question that came in has to do with the oyster fishery in Galveston Bay. What's the status of that fishery, and has there been any interest in doing aquaculture in Galveston Bay now that Texas has effectively legalized aquaculture?
Yes, so aquaculture is a new buzzword around here. As I mentioned, you know, we've taken some pretty hard hits with Hurricane Harvey recently, and many fresh years preceding that. So we have seen some declines in spawning and recruitment, particularly in the northern reaches of the bay, since they're the most impacted from all the rivers incoming there. But I will say we've seen great recruitment in the southern parts of the bay, particularly West Bay. So we still have a pretty abundant wild larvae population, although our commercial folks have had a few rough years. But yes, we were recently given the authority in the state to actually conduct aquaculture. So the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department has been given the jurisdiction to create the regulations for that program. So we are in just the very beginning stages of conducting some of that research and determining how that program will work. But I do know there is some interest in Galveston Bay. It is just still in the very infancy of establishing.
And are there any oyster hatcheries around Galveston Bay right now, or any plans for new ones? Maybe at Texas A&M?
Not that I'm aware of yet. Although I do know A&M Corpus Christi and the Heart Research Institute are working on one down that direction, I believe in Palacios. So I think that will be the first one, at least to my knowledge.
Excellent. Another question that came in has to do with kind of the effects of these restoration efforts. Has water quality and has water clarity and quality improved along the shorelines and in the marsh restoration habitats and near the shell breakwaters?
So that is not something that we have researched directly. I have been in discussion with our partners at A&M Galveston about documenting that. I am not a research scientist, so I will defer to those folks on that question, but they have told me that it is a very hard metric to quantify and capture for such a long area, and there's so many factors that are contributing there. Although it's something I would love to be able to document, because that's a great thing to present to funders. I will say though, tune into our Bay Day virtual event next weekend, or I'm sorry, in 2 weekends from now, and you'll see our filtration experiment of the oysters actually in my backyard, showing just how quickly they can filter water. So I mean, they're doing their job out there if they're growing well. So unfortunately, we have not done that research, but I hope to in the near future.
Excellent, thanks. We just have a couple more questions. I know that you said large-scale projects are the goal for oyster reefs, but have you thought about the possibility of selling to residential users that want a living shoreline at their properties?
Yes, excellent question. So we have actually worked with landowners in the past, assisting them with their living shoreline efforts, and still do to this day. Unfortunately, the oyster shell breakwaters that we've been installing thus far are not ideal for most of those projects because they're so low profile. They don't necessarily provide enough protection for many of these sites. But a lot of those landowners are interested too in just simply reef restoration. We've had 2 or 3 folks who've installed some mulch material off the end of their piers. Now, quite honestly, that's probably for fishing purposes, but hey, it's still returning oysters to the bay. And most of them have placed down a base of rock mulch and then capped it with shell. And so that's something we're looking to assist landowners with in the future as well. We're still working out some glitches with our state regulators to determine the best approach to that, particularly in regards to living shorelines. There are some tricky, how do I say this, tricky regulations associated with the General Land Office. Basically, the state owns all submerged lands and the rights to them, so there are a lot of requirements to get leases and permits to do that kind of work, particularly when it's for a small stretch of privately owned land. So we're actually working on potentially some policy changes with the state and working out a better way to approach that for landowners to incentivize them to use these softer approaches like living shorelines and installing habitat rather than just a simple break or bulkhead. But yes, I think there are a lot of folks interested.
Excellent. So the last couple questions have to do with the oyster shell recycling program. One note came in from the Delaware Bay region. So reef mounding is a historic practice of the extensive aquaculture fishery in the Delaware Bay on private leases. The industry traditionally recycles shells from shucking houses, which is probably an easier way of collecting shell than restaurants because it produces a lot of shell at one time, but few shucking houses exist. So are there any shucking houses in the Galveston, Houston region that you can recruit? And on that same note, have you thought about having drop-off areas where home chefs and home cooks who use oysters can drop off their shells?
Yes, excellent points. We have addressed both of those. As far as shucking houses go, all of the commercial dealers in the state of Texas are required to return a certain percentage of their shell that they collect during harvest back to the bay or directly to the state for their restoration efforts. So most of them are already returning that shell to their private leases or giving it to the state. So unfortunately, we are not able to obtain that. And then as far as we have been investigating that for many years. Unfortunately, our region is just not very, what I want to say, oyster culture friendly. We are more geared towards crawfish boils and that kind of thing. So we really wouldn't have a huge amount of shell coming in that we have witnessed anyhow. And we have had a few individuals contact us wanting to drop off shell. And so we'll take, a few 5-gallon buckets from individuals. We've even had restaurants offered to bring it to us, but there are a lot of potential logistics and liability issues with letting them access our curing sites and that sort of thing. But now that we are moving out to our official headquarters on the bay, we will have more room to potentially set up a public drop-off facility. Our development team has also been in discussion with HEB about potentially having shell recycling at HEB locations, which if y'all aren't familiar with HEB, it is a grocery store down here. And so that would be a great way to solve that issue. So yes, both of those questions are great and are things that we're looking into further. And hopefully we can work more with the state to share that shell resource that they have with some of the commercial dealers so that it can go to both harvestable regions and areas off limits to harvest to support the general oyster population.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Haille. So I think that is going to conclude our webinar today. We hopefully will have another GCAN webinar over the next month, and more information about that will be coming out very soon. Haille, any last words?
Oh, well, just thank you guys so much for the opportunity to be here. And if anyone has further questions, feel free to email me at any time. And I look forward to speaking with all of you again.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.